So I'll talk to us a little bit about the science, how we came up with this, why we think the answers are the way they are. So I'll just start with a brief agenda. Some of the things we'll talk about when we go through this presentation. Introduction, background, I'll explain some of the hydrology, why we think it's changed. I'll talk a little bit about the hydraulic modeling, how it's affected the floodplain, the geomorphic hazards, the actual floodplain mapping itself. We'll talk a little bit about the typical roles and responsibilities that happen after the floodplain mapping, and then we can have some questions. So just a brief intro, Northwest Hydraulics Consultants, we're a water resource specialist firm, founded about 50 years ago now. We have about 200 employees, 50% of us are in BC. We've done dozens of floodplain maps in BC, Alberta, and the United States. There we go. So why do we make floodplain maps? So the purpose is to reduce future harm and hardship from flood events. The project was initiated to reduce the risk of flooding. So this is to help everybody in the floodplain. So we want to develop floodplain maps that illustrate the extent and the elevation of the floodplain to help determine what's suitable design flood and incorporate the most correct, or at least for the moment, channel and floodplain geometry and hydrology in the information. So why? There are floodplain maps. There are several ways to deal with flooding. You have your non-structural approaches and your structural approaches. Floodplain mapping is considered a non-structural approach to deal with flood risk. So that is why we start here. It's one of the first steps in dealing with the flood. Oh, the wrong thing. So as Christina explained, this is part of an overall study. We've already looked at the Carmi to Beaverdale Reach, the Rock Creek to Midway Reach, and now we're on the Grand Forks to Cascade Falls Reach. The boundaries there are marked in red. Coming up soon, Christina Lake and the upstream extents for Grand Forks. So these are where the existing maps already exist. As Christina explained, I won't go into this too much detail, but you can see the existing maps for this reach actually on the table right there. So in addition to the existing maps and the historic flood maps, there was a study completed for the RDKB in 2021, which included the risk assessment, and they included debris flow, debris flood, and flood risk, which is a higher level study. But all of this information basically was used in our study to further our answers too. So now we can get into the hydrology. So we looked at the hydrology of the Kettle River to determine the flows. We looked at the hydrometric gauges all over the watershed, which are just giving us flows and water levels at specific locations, and attempt to find long-term accurate information that's applicable to our study reach. Fortunately for us, there are 3 gauges nearby, 2 on the Kettle River and 1 in the Granby River. All the gauges had relatively long-term records. Oh, sorry, you can't see the bottom one there, but the bottom one is Kettle River near Laurier, which is just on the south side of the border. Kettle River near Ferry is also on the south side of the border. But Laurier is downstream of us and Ferry is upstream of us here right now. So let's look at the flood history. So the annual peak flows, here we go. Annual peak flows of the Kettle River at Ferry gauge. You can see all the past floods for the gauge record here. 2018 is the blue line, show all the way across. It was the largest flood on record. However, we do have anecdotal evidence of a larger flood occurring in 1894, and we have record of it at the Laurier gauge. There's a high water mark. Given that the information is so old, it's difficult to incorporate into the data with any kind of accuracy, but we are still considering it that it is possible that the river has seen a larger flood than the one we just witnessed. There we go. So we completed a frequency analysis on all the historic floods to determine the return periods of the flood events. This plot shows the frequency analysis results from the Kettle River at Ferry gauge. So we see return periods in years on the x-axis, which is across the bottom, and we see the flows on the y-axis. The gray band behind the data, which is what you see here, denotes the uncertainty of the data. So this is the possible range in flows that can occur for any given return period. Now, the high water at ferry gauge, it's, oh, you found a typo, 1894, actually, 1894 was all the way up here is the estimate, but this is the range in uncertainty. So you can imagine how much water must have been coming through that one. So now we've discussed a little bit of the existing conditions. So, oh, let's go back. Hang on a second, technical difficulties. There it is. Back. Does that say previous? Yes. So this is the 200 year. So you can see 200-year return period goes up, follow the line across, and this is our flow. So we're looking at this gauge, I think it's about 700 something. Can't remember off the top of my head. Apologies. So now that we know what it is for existing conditions, now we have to discuss what it might look like in the future. So global temperatures have been rising in recent years and are predicted to further increase over time. Based on the regional studies, it is expected to result in an increase in winter precipitation and a decrease in summer precipitation, as well as a decrease in snowfall. So more of the precipitation is happening as rain instead of snow. So this means that it is projected to result in more frequent and intense extreme rain on snow events. So what we're really seeing is potentially a shift from a spring dominated flood, which is from our snow melt, all the water, the fresh air, all comes down into our rivers and gives us a big flood in the spring, to a winter flood where you have a big rainstorm come down on snow that's already there and it runs off and it floods the river. Similar to what we see on the coast in the coastal mountains. This is what happened in November, which did affect you guys, but not to the level that it affected the Coquihalla, for example. We also used a hydrologic model, projected changes to land cover resulting from the logging, development, and changes in vegetation or forest fires, which is also expected to account for 30% increase in flows. So what does this do to our existing conditions? So there's not actually a trend of increasing flow in our current data. If you remember historical, it looked pretty straight all the way across. There's not an increasing trend in bigger events coming through. And the simulated future climate projections don't indicate that there's going to be an increase in spring flows. However, as I explained, we're now seeing bigger winter events, bigger rain on snow and high intensity events occurring into the future. We're likely to see a shift from spring flood events to winter flood events. So to account for that, we've had to adjust the data, provide it's called a skew, provide a positive skew that looks similar to more coastal mountains to reflect that they're now going to be winter events rather than spring events. Now, these are projections. Of course, this is going into the future. This isn't, you're not going to see a winter flood maybe next year or even in the next 10 years due to its predictions based on climate models. This could be 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, 100 years. It's very uncertain. Now, there is one more influence on the hydrology on the rivers is that the Kettle and the Granby River are two very different rivers and do very different things, and they don't actually peak at the same time. The Granby River peaks first, and then the Kettle River peaks second. So we had to take this into account in our hydraulic modeling to account for the time delay for the flood from the Kettle to reach the area versus when the Granby floods the area. So all this information gets piled in and we collect it all, and then we build the hydraulic model with it. So the hydraulic model was created for the Kettle River from Grand Forks to Cascade Falls. We created it in HECRAS, which is a computer program built to simulate floods. We used the land cover pulled from aerial imagery and the LiDAR. So there's our land cover. There's our LiDAR. That's our actual LiDAR. So this is the surface of the land as it comes through here. We went out and surveyed the river, and we incorporated all the bathymetry for all this area and cut it into the LiDAR. So using the hydraulic model, I create a mesh, which is full of cells, which is what you see here in the river, and we simulate water across them, and all the cells collect all the information and return it to us in a form we can understand, which looks like water surface elevation. So this is one of the floods. So this is water surface elevation upstream to downstream. We use it to also tell us the velocities in the river, how fast the water is moving across the floodplain versus in the channel. We get it to tell us the depths, how deep the water is on the floodplain versus the channel. And we use it to tell us where the water is going exactly. So we look at how the water is moving. We look at, is it coming close to corners? Does it bend around? Where does it cut the floodplain off? All that information gets taken into account. And who uses this information the most? I use it to create the floodplain maps, but the geomorphologists actually take this information and they do a further analysis with it. So once we complete the hydraulic model, the geomorphology analysis begins, and they study the landform and the processes that develop or change them. So the flow of water and sediment, particularly during high flows, is a defining influence on the river geomorphology. So over time, particularly with changes in hydrology and sediment and land cover, rivers can change in lateral, side to side. They can change in vertical position, deeper, shallower, or they can change in dimension, both narrower and wider. This typically threatens infrastructure and residents near the river. These changes can occur gradually over many years and multiple floods, or they can occur in a single flood. So we study the geomorphology by going into the field and taking observations. We look at the bank erosion, the scour, the lateral migration, the avulsion, which is just the chance of the river suddenly changing its path, going over a bank and making a new path, the aggradation, the degradation, and we look at the alluvial fans. Now on the Kettle River, it appears to be mostly a fairly stable channel with limited lateral erosion from the 1960s to now. The overall erosion rate is about 0.1 meters per year. But there have been some shifts in recent times, particularly the 2018 event. We did see up to 15 meters erosion in this reach during that event. So in addition to looking at the Kettle River, we also looked at the alluvial fans. So NHC identified alluvial fans in the area. So alluvial fan is a fan-shaped deposit of soil and rocks. They form where fast-moving water flattens out over a floodplain. So coming from a steep slope to a shallow slope, the water comes down and it spreads out and it deposits all of its sediments in a fan-shaped pattern. Usually found in mountain ranges, typically. Some fans are old, so where the deposits and the water source no longer exists, or like it occurred during the last glaciation period, for example. And then we have newer modern fans, which are formed by creeks and rivers we see today. They can be dangerous because, there's my fan. They can be dangerous because they have a tendency to change. The creeks will reroute themselves across the fan, and these changes, which we call avulsions, are caused by sediment filling up the channel and debris such as trees coming down and blocking the channel. They can also flood violently, bringing down large quantities of sediment and debris, causing debris floods and debris flows. Now, we didn't study debris floods and debris flows on any of the fans, so I'm not going to really go into it, but the difference is the percent of water. So debris flow has more dirt and material in it than just a basic clear water flood. So this leads us to our floodplain maps, what everybody came to see. So the maps show the flood extents and the flood construction levels, which is the elevation of the flood plus a freeboard. The freeboard is to account for the local water surface variations and uncertainty. So this is a tree falls into the water and changes the water surface elevation locally, or there's cars caught, things you can't account for in the basic topography. Now on our maps, we've mapped the floodway and the flood fringe. The floodway designates where the majority of the flood is conveyed. This region is mapped to delineate where development is not recommended, as the development is subject to greater flood hazard. This is where you have either fast moving water or very deep water. The flood fringe designates where the land flood inundation is expected to be inundated with flood water during the design flood. not necessarily deep or not necessarily moving fast. So bringing back to the geomorphology, which we just discussed, how are they represented on the map? So we mapped a high fluvial hazard, a moderate fluvial hazard, and an unrated fan hazard. So what that means is that yellow line you see is the zone included where the areas may be impacted by erosion. So you can see this is the possible kind of erosion extent that might occur during a single event or a series of small events if no effort is maintained to stop the river from moving there. The purple line, which you see here, is what we consider to be like the modern valley bottom. This is where the river could possibly go given a longer term lifespan, like we're talking 100 years. If you make no effort to stop the river, it could eventually shift over in those directions. And also we mapped in pink are the alluvial fans. They are unrated because you have to go to every single fan and study it and the creek and all the information about it to accurately map down where you think the water would go. So we've identified that they exist, but we haven't individually mapped every single fan. So what's next? So the floodplain provides information on the most current understanding of the flood hazard for our study reach. The information identifies where the flood hazards resulting from the Kettle River are most likely to occur and to what depth. The information can be used to support land use planning, emergency preparedness, and other flood mitigation measures. So we can look at non-structural measures, which are the land use planning, the emergency planning, or there's structural measures such as dikes or setbacks, armoring, etc. So who, and Christina will probably get into this a little bit more, but who is responsible? So every different level of government has different responsibilities for this type of work. The responsibility of mitigating flood risk is shared between all the levels of those who live, work, and have property within the floodplain. The federal government's role is typically limited to national strategies and funding, such as support for floodplain mapping, construction of structural mitigation measures, and in the worst case, post-disaster recovery. However, it's generally limited to uninsurable assets. The provincial government provides additional funding and guidelines for flood mitigation, as well as forecasting, such as the BC River Forecast Center, which is the bottom picture there. And then there's the snowpack forecasting, which is the top river there, as well as they also regulate the dike safety and support the emergency response and recovery from floods and other disasters. So on our more local scale, so local governments are tasked with identifying flood hazards, such as the development of these floodplain maps, land use planning, for example, to avoid increasing vulnerable or high consequence development within the floodplain, and the emergency response and evacuations. Occupants within or near the floodplain are responsible to be informed of the hazards, prepare their local households or businesses for a flood, purchase flood insurance, prepare for evacuation prior to a flood, and follow evacuation orders during a flood. As shown in the top figure, preparing a home or business can include elevating the structure, constructing a permanent or temporary barrier around a structure, ensuring the structure itself holds the flood back, the flood waters back. Don't typically do that in BC. Or in minimizing the flood damage sustained when a structure is inundated. So in BC, the most common approaches are either to elevate the structure above the flood construction level or prepare the structure for flooding. The bottom figure is the Provincial Flood Preparedness Guide, which illustrates these approaches: elevating the high-risk assets, securing propane tanks, adding checks on water sewer lines and valves, using flood-resistant building materials below the FCL. Businesses are also responsible to prepare for floods by having a business community plan and to ensure operations can continue to restart quickly following a flood. So the maps were completed. They're still in draft form. As you can see, we are taking into consideration local variations. If you observe one and you don't think it's right, we will definitely go back to and look at that area. They were completed using the best practice in the floodplain mapping, the industry standards, considering the federal guidelines, the EGBC, which is the Engineers Geoscientists guidelines, and the soon-to-be provincial guidelines, which are hopefully coming out soon. It can be conservative in nature, but the examples provided can show you how to build and live within their framework.